And now some news from the world over. Pope Francis has issued a letter to all the faithful condemning the crime of priestly sexual abuse and its cover-up. He refers to the Pennsylvania grand jury report that alleged that more than 1,000 victims were abused by priests over 70 years. The Pope acknowledged that no effort to beg forgiveness will be sufficient, vowing, quote, never again, and demanding future accountability. Francis blamed clericalism in part for the problem, but he did not propose any specific measures or sanctions for bishops who covered up abuse. Francis will be meeting with abuse victims in Ireland during the World Meeting of Families. And the fallout from the Theodore McCarrick scandal continues to play out in the Archdiocese of Newark. In wide-ranging interviews with EWTN's Catholic news agency, 6 priests shed light on McCarrick's, quote, well-known reputation for having a fondness for handsome seminarians when he was archbishop there, and that within the archdiocese there is a subculture of actively homosexual priests that has existed for at least the past 30 years, according to these witnesses. Fearing reprisals, the priest asked to remain anonymous, including one who worked with McCarrick in the Newark Chancery. Among the McCarrick allegations, he would touch seminarians inappropriately. He would invite young men to stay the night in the cathedral rectory. 3 of the priests reported being invited to sexually charged cocktail parties with other priests in attendance. One said that he was led into the room to a chorus of wolf whistles and that he felt like he was on display. After the published CNA report, Cardinal Archbishop Joseph Tobin seemed to deny any knowledge of a gay subculture among the priests. The Archdiocese released a statement saying, quote, no one, including the anonymous sources cited in the article, has ever spoken to Cardinal Tobin about a gay subculture. Separately, Tobin has instructed priests to no longer speak to the press about the current scandals. Joining me now to offer his insight into the sex abuse crisis and explain his letter to the priests and seminarians and people of his diocese is Bishop Robert Morlino. He joins us from his offices in Madison, Wisconsin. Bishop, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Raymond, and greetings to you, good wishes and prayers, and to all of your viewers. I just want to say at the outset that I do once again apologize to the victims of all the terrible abuse that's been uncovered more recently. And I can't say enough about how I care for the pain that they feel, and that I'm really with them in prayer and with fraternal affection. I hope that I can really help to move things forward so that they will not have to worry that this is going to continue to happen. And that's why I began my letter saying I'm tired of it. So there you are.
Bishop Morlino, as you mentioned, that letter you wrote this past weekend to members of your diocese, in it you address this crisis of sin that we are seeing throughout the church today, and you write, and we'll put it up on the screen, for too long we have diminished the reality of sin. We've refused to call a sin, and we have excused sin in the name of mistaken notion of mercy. There is a certain comfort level with sin that has come to pervade our teaching, our preaching, our decision-making, and our very way of living. If you'll permit me, what the church needs now is more hatred. And you go on to say, hatred of sin. What does that mean, Your Excellency?
Well, it simply means that the Lord created in us a good deal of different types of psychic energy. And one of those types of psychic energy, Raymond, is hatred. So hatred must be good for something. And it's good for hating evil. It's good for hating evil, never hating evildoers, but it's good for hating evil. It's good for hating the devil. And I'm afraid that a lot of people today don't believe in the devil, and I mean Catholics. And I'm afraid that too often people have excused themselves from sinful behavior by saying, I'm following my conscience, and that's the highest law. And that, of course, has been the linchpin of so many problems since the Vatican Council, because the idea of the supremacy of conscience, plain English, is really against the documents of Vatican II, the Declaration of Religious Freedom. It's right at the beginning, and it's clear as a bell. Conscience does not dispense us from following the teaching of the Church.
Your Excellency, I need to dwell on one part of the letter that has gotten a lot of attention from people around the world who read this letter. You've gotten a lot of press coverage on it. You target and hone in on a subculture within the hierarchy as the main problem, the driving force of the sex abuse crisis that we're watching unfold before us. You write this, but to be clear, in the specific situations at hand, we are talking about deviant, sexual, almost exclusively homosexual acts by clerics. We're also talking about homosexual propositions and abuses against seminarians and young priests by powerful priests, bishops, and cardinals. We are talking about acts and actions which are not only in violation of the sacred promises made by some, in short, sacrilege, but also are in violation of the natural moral law for all. To call it anything else would be deceitful and would only ignore the problem further. Your Excellency, give me your sense of what you were getting at here. Why is that such a big deal today? And why are so few people seeing the problem and the issue the way you are?
Well, there's been a desire on the part of some, since our Dallas Charter was issued, to keep the problem of the abuse, sexual abuse by clerics, to keep it away from homosexuality and move it toward pedophilia. But the statistics belie that. At least 80% of those abused were post-pubescent males being abused by other adult males. Now, that is not pedophilia, it's more properly ephebophilia. It's a kind of homosexuality. There's no question really about that. Mm-hmm. And when I say hierarchy, there's been some misunderstanding there. I don't just mean bishops, I mean bishops, priests, and deacons. Mm-hmm. Those who hold the three ranks in the hierarchy. And there have been problems, serious problems at all three levels. And again, it's rooted in this lack of sensitivity to sinfulness. So many Catholics believe either that there is no afterlife or that everybody's going to heaven. And when I go to funerals, I see one canonization after another. And you know, there's no thought of purgatory. Mm-hmm. It's alleluia, alleluia, period. Well, there's no period. As I say often, I sometimes think that someday I'm going to be in purgatory. St. Peter's going to throw me a key and ask me to lock up after everybody else has left.
Well, save me a spot, please. I want to go on in your letter because you write this. It is time to admit that there is a homosexual subculture within the hierarchy of the Catholic Church that is wreaking great devastation in the vineyard of the Lord. The Church's teaching is clear that the homosexual inclination is not in itself sinful, but it is intrinsically disordered in a way that renders any man stably afflicted by it unfit to be a priest. And the decision to act upon this disordered inclination is a sin so grave that it cries out to heaven for vengeance. Now, some will say, Bishop, reading this letter, that you are blaming homosexuality for the problems in the Church and for the sex abuse crisis. You would say what?
I would say that homosexuality is at the root of this. For reasons that I just explained, Raymond. I don't have any hatred in my heart for homosexuals. I don't have any desire to bash them. Mm-hmm. But I do owe them respect by speaking the truth. And this is a very difficult area in which to speak the truth because the minute you speak the truth, you're called a hater. I mean, that's along the lines of some of the mail that I've been getting. But I think it's so very important to keep in mind the hierarchy means priests, bishops, deacons, and that homosexual subculture doesn't mean an institution. It just means situations like having beach houses where certain people come and gather frequently, and illicit behavior, sinful behavior happens there. Well, if that kind of thing is happening, that's an instance of a gay subculture. I think some people think when I say gay subculture that bishops have gotten together and organized this. Well, first of all, if somebody said, do you really believe that, I would say no. And secondly, I don't have any proof that anything like that had happened. So when some bishops are saying, what's this about a subculture? I don't see any subculture. I think they mean they don't see an institution, an organized institution. But that's not what this is. This is something where it's easy to turn and look the other way while certain behavior is engaged.
Do you
And
believe
we've got to stop looking away.
Do you believe that this is primarily in the seminaries, in the seminary formation houses? We're reading reports, which I'll get to in a minute. I mentioned it earlier. In Newark, New Jersey, Catholic News Agency broke this story this week. 6 priests coming forward that claim there has been a homosexual subculture in the seminary there for 30 years. Cardinal Tobin denies that subculture exists.
Well, in terms of the seminaries that I've used, for the sake of complete transparency, we were sending collegians regularly to the college program at Seton Hall, St. Andrew's Hall, as they call it. And of course, I find out that there was a problem there. But I must say that my seminarians and I are in very good contact. And while they were there, I never had anyone speak to me about anything like that. In the college seminary, I don't know anything about the theology, but in the college seminary, I never had anybody speak a word to me about that. So again, while I want to get the facts out and I want there to be that kind of an investigation, I'm not claiming to have the facts now. So I'm not saying this one should resign, that one should be fired. I'm not in any position to do that.
Now, some would say, Your Excellency, and reading your piece, reading the reaction to it, people say the vow of celibacy should be lifted, or you should let priests marry. Your thoughts on that as a solution to what we're dealing with here?
Well, I think if we look at the state of marriage in the world, where people don't even have a clear idea of what marriage is, I think to say that this is going to be the solution is more than far-fetched. I don't know how it would work. For instance, when we had marriage among the Eastern clergy in Eastern Europe, the role of women in society that kind of allowed for that was very different from the role of women in society that we have now in the United States. And I don't know culturally if that would work, if women would really be willing to enter into that kind of a marriage where she was always considered the priest's helper, because that's how people would look on her. And maybe she'd want to have a life of her own. That wouldn't make things so easy. And then worse than that is the problem of divorce. I don't see any reason to believe that priests are going to have a rate of divorce any lower than any other group. As a matter of fact, it might be higher because they've had so little experience usually until a higher age. So if priests are going to get divorced, well then even if they don't remarry or whatever, what are we going? There are a lot of people in parishes who would say, "I don't want a divorced priest." Well, then what?
Yeah.
Is the bishop going to be liable for them, and then also to take care of their family? It would bankrupt the church. It's not very feasible from a practical point of view. And people who say things like that should really think it through a little bit more carefully.
Let's talk for a moment about your suggestion here that, and I have to return to this, it's made most of the news, where you seem to be saying gay men should not be allowed in the priesthood, but there are other clerics who are saying something very different. Cardinal Supich in Chicago had this to say. I'll put this up in an interview. He said, "I really believe that the issue here is more about a culture of clericalism in which some are ordained and they feel they're privileged and therefore protected so that they can do what they want. People, whether heterosexual or homosexual, need to live by the gospel." He added that he would not want to reduce this simply to the fact that there are some priests who are homosexual. I think that is a diversion to get away from the clericalism that's much deeper as a part of this problem. Your reaction to that. Is clericalism the problem?
Well, first of all, I would say that clericalism to me means that the priest is put up on a pedestal, or the bishop is put up on a pedestal, in a few words. That's what it means to me. I haven't seen that. I mean, I know what it was when I was a little boy, and I was growing up, and the priest and the bishop were on a pedestal. Priests today can be treated very poorly in a parish. And I can vouch, I've been a bishop for almost 20 years. I can vouch that the treatment that I receive hardly places me on a pedestal. So that's what I mean by clericalism, and I don't experience it. I don't experience it in my own life. I think the real problem, though, here, in terms of celibacy, is celibacy doesn't only involve physical abstinence. It involves an attitude of mind and heart, an attitude which is a virtue, and that is accepting God's grace to sacrifice the companionship of marriage. When the celibate is abstaining physically, what he's thinking is, my God, the Lord gives me the grace to sacrifice the companionship of marriage. My God. And that brings about a kind of a quasi-mystical sense of the presence of God in one's life. Now, if one is homosexual, one is not attracted to marriage of a woman. That is, one is not attracted to marriage. And if you're not attracted to something, you can't sacrifice it. So even if there is abstinence in the body, the attitude of mind and heart for someone who is genuinely homosexual cannot be present. That is, I'm sacrificing marriage and it hurts. Meaning marriage to a woman.
No, Cardinal George said years ago, you have to see yourself as a father and as a husband in the natural order, and then because you're supernaturally wedded to the church, and if you can't see yourself that way, then you really are. This is an incompatible lifestyle for you. I want to quickly return to this notion of clericalism, because I hear a lot of it this week, that clericalism is to blame. That's the root of the problem here. Even the Pope in his letter mentions clericalism. It seems to me if clericalism is its own network of protection, where people feel they're little kings and above the law, maybe that's what they're speaking to. But in that sense, I mean, frankly, ambition or the desire for prestige or money, I see that in many, many professions. I don't see people chasing little kids around, or teenagers around with a predisposition to money or power or wealth. Are they missing the mark here? I mean, in some ways, this is a little bit like blaming a drunken collision on the tire suspension. It seems to me we're missing the point of who and what is driving the crisis.
Well, I could only say from my point of view that clericalism, as I experience it, what is called clericalism, has to do with wearing cassocks or having nice vestments at Mass, or wearing the cassock too often, and insisting upon titles and all of this. Some of our seminarians and younger priests want to sacrifice marriage for a clear priestly identity. And they find that cassocks and titles and nice vestments deepen their sense of the otherness of the priesthood, deepen their sense that they are sacred, deepen their sense that they are a mystery to themselves. And that is the kind of spirituality in which they want to be formed. Now, I think to call that clericalism is, again, not to listen to what they're saying.
I want to move on to the remedies for this, Your Excellency. Only the Holy See can investigate and discipline bishops. What should the Bishops' Conference do now? There are some calls to meet before November. Do you think that's a good idea? Warranted?
That's a tough one for me. I don't know, because I don't know if the meeting, when we say before November, our administrative board meets in September. And I don't see that we could really put something together that would be effective before November. And that's part of the problem with our conference. Our conference can do many good things, but one of the things our conference has never been able to do is to act quickly. And when we run into a situation in the church that demands a swift response, the conference is simply not capable. It is too large. It requires a bureaucracy. We can't find fault with how many bishops there are in the United States.
Right.
At least I can't. I mean, that's way above my pay grade. But I think that trying to pull something together that would be effective would probably draw huge amounts of demonstrators. And then if we really weren't well prepared, I think it could make the situation worse. That's my personal opinion. If some others would like to have an earlier meeting, I would certainly do my best to be there.
I want to call your attention to Bishop Egan of Portsmouth in the UK. He's suggesting that the Holy Father convene an extraordinary synod to deal with the life and ministry of clerics and to give some guidance from the Vatican level on all of this. Is that needed now?
Well, I think that would be one approach. And I also think that an approach that would be useful would be to have the Holy Father appoint an apostolic visitator to the United States, who could then assemble a team and would have the faculties from the Holy Father to investigate. I think something concrete has to begin. And when I say I don't know if we could pull a meeting together before November, I'm not saying we can't do anything. I mean, this does demand a more immediate response.
Right.
But our conference isn't into immediate responses.
Yeah. Well, the church isn't into immediate responses, which is part of the problem here.
Right.
I mean, the U.S. isn't alone in dealing with this, sex abuse crisis and cover-ups. I mean, we're seeing it in Chile. We're seeing it with Archbishop McCarrick. You're seeing it in Colombia. Here's the question. The Pope set up investigatory protocols in 2016 and a tribunal. He has since dismantled those, and those were constructed to discipline bishops. Do you think perhaps it's time to convene something like that? And why shouldn't McCarrick face the music in Rome?
Well, clearly something has to be done with regard to Cardinal McCarrick. I pray that he and others who have been involved in misconduct or in cover-up, both of which are very seriously sinful, I hope that somehow the Lord can still keep them safe in his providence, whatever that might mean. Mm-hmm. And I don't wish them any ill. As far as having a special tribunal, I suspect that those who were supposed to set up the tribunal had their reasons for convincing the Pope not to do it or to postpone it. And I don't know what those reasons are. Mm-hmm. So once again, if I don't have all the facts, I'm stuck.
Yeah. Pope Francis is meeting with victims of sex abuse while he's in Ireland attending the World Meeting of Families. What impact do you think this crisis is having on that meeting, and how might it change the focus of that youth synod in October?
Well, I'm very concerned about both of these situations because if, for example, statements were to come out of the synod which are ambiguous, as some of the statements were that came out of the last two synods, if they're ambiguous, I'm just afraid that it's going to unwittingly contribute to the comfort level with sin. Mm. If the ambiguity tends to say there's more latitude here for what we used to call sin. Mm. And I really don't think we should go that way. And I suppose, very honestly, if it were simply up to me, and this is my personal opinion, mm-hmm. that I would probably have canceled both of those events. Mm-hmm. I think I would probably have canceled both meetings and then pull together some of those resources to see what could be done concretely to impact the scandal that we have now. Mm-hmm.
Before I let you go, I asked Cardinal Burke about this last week. Some have floated to me the idea, and I think it a good one, to have an independent forensic financial audit of every diocese in the United States. The idea being that would uncover the financial misdeeds which very often lead to the personal and sexual misdeeds. Would you support something like that, and lay involvement being an independent forensic audit?
I would. And we have an independent audit every year, mm-hmm. and that audit is always made public, and that audit has uncovered, in fact, some misdeeds, financial misdeeds, that were happening in certain parishes. Mm-hmm. And yes, I would favor that. I think that without somehow having the key role of the bishop as teacher, sanctifier, and governor, without having those key elements compromised, I think we need as much transparency and as much competent, faith-filled lay involvement as is possible. Mm-hmm. But the lay involvement has to be competent, and it really has to be faithful. Mm-hmm. These people have to be people who would be willing to make the profession of faith and take the oath of fidelity to the church. They have to be that. I'm not saying they literally have to do that, but they have to be that kind of person.
Right. Final question. It seems to me your letter identifies that we have a recruitment, a retention, and an advancement problem in the church. How do you cure that? Are there processes, are there watchdogs you can install to make sure that the recruitment of priests, the retention, and the advancement of them up the hierarchical ladder can be protected?
Well, I can only, I am doing that in this diocese. And we're very carefully on the watch. And many other bishops are very carefully on the watch, too. Obviously, some are not as vigilant as they need to be. But here we're doing what we can. And I think this is where maybe as a conference, we could talk about best practices, you know, in those three areas to make sure. But those things are very, very well cared for in this diocese. And as a matter of fact, if there's been advancement, it's been, any significant advancement has been at the initiative of the Holy See.
Very good. Bishop Robert Morlino, I thank you so much for the time. And you can read Bishop Morlino's full letter at madisondiocese.org.